In this lesson, we will examine some anchor lessons for use of ICT for learning. Before we begin, let's recap by looking at the decision tree for the use of ICT for learning. As you learned in the previous lesson, the decision tree is built around 4 questions, and each question corresponds to a big idea in the use of ICT for learning. The first relates to whether the students have the opportunity to use ICT in the learning activity. The second is to determine if ICT supports students' knowledge construction. The third question asks if ICT is required for constructing this knowledge. The fourth question asks if the students are designers of an ICT product. Considering each of these questions is useful when designing a learning activity. In doing this, you also need to consider how much opportunity you want to give your students to use ICT for learning. As outlined in the previous lesson, the use of ICT for learning decision tree can also be represented as a rubric. As you can see, each of the numbers 1 to 5 outline the criteria for the condition for the code. For example, to achieve a code 3, students use ICT to support knowledge construction, but they could construct the same knowledge without using ICT. You can decide which you find easier to use, the decision tree or the rubric, when designing your learning activities. We're now going to code a number of anchor lessons. It is important to note that these anchor lessons, which outline a series of learning activities, are not sample, model, or exemplar lessons. While they are lessons that have been designed and used by teachers, they have been deliberately selected to initiate discussions around learning design and, in this case, the use of ICT as part of the learning activity. This is why they are referred to as anchor lessons, as they help anchor our thoughts around particular ideas. We are not making judgments on these lessons. We are simply looking for evidence of ICT use in the learning activity. Remember, these are not scores, but codes, which describe the type of ICT use for learning present in the activity. To begin, please download the learning activity entitled Munting Mungo. When you have done this, carefully read it and make notes of your observations about what evidence there is that the students are engaged in ICT use for learning. Then, based on your observations, make a decision about the level of ICT use that you find in this learning activity. In deciding how to code it, you need to be able to point to evidence in order to justify the code you select. Remember, you are not looking for what you think you might do. Instead, you are looking for evidence to support the code you are giving this learning activity. Having examined the Munting Mungo, please indicate the code you assign to this learning activity. We would encourage you to join the discussion area where you can share your views on how you coded this learning activity. What code did you assign the Munting Mungo activity in terms of ICT use for learning? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? The Munting Mungo learning activity is a code 2. That is, students use ICT to learn or practice basic skills or reproduce information. They are not constructing knowledge. Where did we get the evidence for this? Students typed the final worksheet that they submitted, but the ICT was not used to construct knowledge. Now, please download the learning activity entitled Great Train Internet. When you've done this, carefully read it and make notes of your observations about what evidence there is that the students are engaged in the use of ICT for learning. Then, based on your observations, make a decision about the level of ICT use that you find in this learning activity. In deciding how to code it, you need to be able to point to evidence in order to justify the code you select. Using the ICT for Learning rubric, how would you code the Great Train Internet anchor lesson? As before, we would encourage you to join the discussion area where you can share your views on how you coded the activity. What code did you assign Great train Internet in relation to use of ICT for learning? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? In the Great Train Internet activity, students use ICT, websites and other computer resources to learn about the Victorian era. They had to analyse the information they found in order to decide what was most important to present to their classmates. So the activity counts as knowledge building. However, ICT was not pedagogically necessary because students could have built the same knowledge using books in a library or a print encyclopedia. Therefore, the evidence in the anchor lesson, Great Train Internet, points to a code 3 for this learning activity. This means that students use ICT to support knowledge construction, but they could construct the same knowledge without using ICT. Finally, please download the anchor lesson entitled Falklands War. When you've done this, carefully read it while making notes of your observations, then make a decision about the level of ICT use that you find in this learning activity. Having examined the Falklands War anchor lesson, please indicate the code you are going to assign this learning activity. As before, we would encourage you to join the discussion area where you can share your views on how you coded the activity. What code did you assign the Falklands War anchor lesson in relation to use of ICT for learning? What evidence can you point to in order to substantiate your decision? In the Falklands War anchor lesson, the activity required students to use the internet to collect and review multiple international sources of information about the Falklands War. Since this is a very specialised topic, it would have been difficult to access the content needed for knowledge construction without ICT use. Students created an interactive website to disseminate their learning to a specific audience. Therefore, the evidence in the Falklands War points to a code 5 for this learning activity. This means that students use ICT to support knowledge construction, and that ICT is required for constructing this knowledge, and students do create an ICT product for authentic users. Now that you've examined a number of anchor lessons, you can see how the ICT for Learning rubric is a useful framework when designing learning activities in order to develop student ICT skills. In this lesson, we have examined a number of anchor lessons in order to explore how to design learning activities that develop students' use of ICT for learning. In the next lesson, we will examine use of ICT for learning in action.